Hello, friends and adventurers. It's Rob, the D&D wannabe, coming in before the show to share some great news. New news! Our podcast has been supported for months now by Misty Mountain Gaming, and they're now rewarding you, our listeners, with savings on all their fine D&D products such as metal dice, stone dice, glass dice, miniatures, adventures, dice trays, and more. You can use the code TWINS10, that's TWINS10, to save 10% on all purchases made in their online store at mistymountaingaming.com. Every code redeemed helps support Steven and I, and encourages us to make more and better content for you. So be sure to use code TWINS10 whenever you're buying premium Dungeons & Dragons dice and gear from our good friends at mistymountaingaming.com. Okay, on with the show.
Hi, Millie Bays here, your Eldritch Blastin', Longer Lastin', Magic Castin' Warlock, and are you tired of your spells failing to inflict damage on your opponents? Fire fizzles, Psychic sucks, and Thunder blunders. If you want your enemies to stop laughing at you, just force it! Watch how force damage uses the power of force to hurt your enemies no matter their resistances, making your foes fall like magic! Have you ever accidentally unleashed a cabal of angry ghosts from a forgotten crypt? Well, force damage is tough on undead and can be cast as often as you want. No limited spell slots needed. If you save one spell slot, the new Eldritch Blast with force damage has paid for itself. May the force be with you. For those pesky fiends, force damage is a must. Watch how it goes deep down through your enemy's resistances to cause internal bleeding, ruptured organs, and tenderizes while it works. Force damage, force damage, force damage, dishing out more pain than your opponent's bodies have room for. Just listen to these reviews from our mangled opponents. Oh right, you can't! They're dead! Some creatures are immune to certain damage types, but force damage is safe to use on almost every monster in the manual. It's the damage type for all the things you hate. Add a dose of force damage to every combat encounter. It'll dependably do what it's supposed to do, even when other damage types won't. So don't just damage it, force it! Welcome back, listeners and adventurers, to another season of Bardic Twinspiration. This podcast has circumnavigated the nearest star and come back around to you in your podcast feed.
Happy birthday, Bardic Twinspiration. You're a year older now. People will begin to have expectations of you.
And we look forward to meeting those expectations at some other point in the future.
Yeah, probably birthday number 2.
Well, returning for Season 2, here I am, Steven, your co-host, back again with my brother, the D&D wannabe.
That's me. Hi, I'm Rob. I talk about D&D a lot because I like it a lot. So, to start off Season 2 of Bardic Twinspiration, we have decided to talk about everyone's most favoritist thing in Dungeons & Dragons, damage.
Oh, I thought you were going to say statistics. Is that just me?
That might be just you. See, for me, it's roleplay, but Dungeons & Dragons wants you to deal damage. Dungeons & Dragons wants and expects you to fight your enemies. The class features are all designed around bigger and better ways to hurt things. The spells want you to hurt things, or at least many of them do. And there's a lot more rules concerning combat than anything else in the game. So, how you are dealing damage to your opponents is a pretty important aspect of 5e.
And that comes from Dungeons & Dragons' roots as a war game originally. So we can't get away from combat being a central part of what makes this a game, as opposed to simply a storytelling exercise.
More recent editions, 5e especially, has definitely put a roleplay foot forward, if you will. They want that to be a bigger part of the game, but in keeping with tradition and keeping it recognizably Dungeons & Dragons, there still is a big focus on making the bad guys go away.
I mean, what is Dungeons & Dragons even without math? And that's why I say statistics is one of the things that makes me excited about Dungeons & Dragons, because it's finding a way to make those numbers work for you. We got off on a little bit of a tangent. Okay, I guess I should say I got off on a bit of a tangent when I was doing my research for the cantrips episode, because there are a lot of spells out there that functioned in very similar ways, but just happen to deal a different type of damage, particularly in the area where cantrips were concerned.
And you know how most people would react to this information? They would say, that's interesting, and move on with their lives. They would not, on their own free time, make an Excel document turning all of the damage types into a spreadsheet.
Well, I thought to myself, how am I supposed to rank these cantrips if I don't understand the different damage types and how effective each of them are against the monsters in Dungeons & Dragons? So it did lead down a little bit of a rabbit trail where I was trying to figure out the vulnerabilities and resistances and immunities of all the different monsters in Dungeons & Dragons and how they applied to the different types of damage that cantrips could produce. And it ended up providing the framework for how I ranked the cantrips and how I intend to eventually rank all the other spells. So before I get to doing any of that, I realized that I actually kind of need to explain said framework.
Dear listener, I know this is an audio-only format and that you cannot see anything that is on our faces or that we are looking at on our screens, but Steve has created an Excel document documenting all kinds of things, and it is a thing of beauty, and I'm going to continue to make fun of him for it, but it is elegant in its simplicity, and we will be making it available to you in the description of this episode.
Well, I might need to update my formatting a little bit. But it's like I said before. At the end of the day, Dungeons & Dragons is about math. So interpreting those numbers is kind of one of the things that I enjoy about the game. It's one of the things that makes me a, let's call it an optimizer. Because I think the dedicated min-maxers out there can put me to shame. But, you know, also with that being said, I don't think too many people have taken the time to do this. So I think I fall into a weird little place in the D&D community.
I think it comes from the point of you wanting to be confident that you made an effective choice. And you didn't realize going into the cantrips episode just how many variables there were when it comes to hurting something the way you want to hurt it in D&D 5e. And to be frank, I felt pretty good about what I knew, and then you actually researched the topic. So even people who are pretty familiar with 5e may be surprised by some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. I certainly was.
Right. I know that when we were talking about the different saves and monster proficiencies, that there were a lot of things that you found surprising. Some of them made it into the episode, some of them didn't. And maybe we'll cover those at a different time. I don't think that will be as involved of a conversation so as to take up so much time, because after all, there are only 6 saving throws and a good 10 damage types.
Well, that is the magical damage types. We're not including bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing, any physical damage or weapon damage in this particular episode. We'll bring those up at a later time.
Right, we are specifically going to be addressing the different types of damage that spells can produce. We're going to be throwing out the physical damage types because, well, to be honest, the numbers aren't that dissimilar, nor do a great number of spells produce those damage types, so we're just talking about everything else. Alright, last thing before we begin. As we go through these damage types, we're going to talk about out of the 2,453 monsters that are currently on D&D Beyond, I know there are going to be a few more that are releasing soon, are vulnerable, resistant, and immune to that specific damage type. We'll also talk about how those numbers stack up against some of the others in terms of are they the most resistant, the least vulnerable, etc. And then maybe discuss a few instances where this damage type would be particularly effective.
Well, we've got 10 topics to cover, it sounds like, so why don't we go ahead and get started by talking about acid damage. So, just first impressions, I don't know of a lot of spells that are dealing acid damage. Acid damage is usually something that gets used against the party in forms of, like, oozes or corrosive traps and the like, but I know that there are spells like Primal Savagery as a cantrip that give you pretty early instantaneous access to this spell. So you can be using this from the very beginning of your journey. So how effective is it?
Let's talk about that. I used to equate acid damage and poison damage, but it turns out the two could almost not be further apart as far as damage types are concerned. Aside from the two being typically associated in my mind with some sort of green liquid that is bad for you, they don't share a lot of similarities, it turns out. Acid damage, in my book, pretty good.
I guess we should go ahead and distinguish that. In case anyone is confused, acid is a corrosive type of damage. It eats away at organic substances, like the flesh of your character, and it can hurt the outside just as well as the inside. All it has to do is contact organic material, and that organic material is going away.
Rob, out of the 10 damage types, where do you think that acid damage falls on my personal spectrum?
Well, and let's be clear, your personal spectrum is much closer to objectivity than my spectrum. I like flavor, you like function.
At least it's based on something. I'm sure there's a lot of situations, like one of the things that I didn't take into account when I decided to rank the 10 damage types, because of course I decided to rank the 10 damage types, is how likely you are to run into the monsters that are vulnerable, resistant, or immune to these things, based on your level or based on how early they came out in terms of the splat books. Let's face it, if you go to a random Dungeons & Dragons table anywhere in the world, you are most likely to encounter monsters from the original monster manual, followed by Volo's Guide to Monsters, and so on and so forth until you come to the most recently released book. They haven't been out as long, Dungeon Masters haven't tried them out as much, they're going to be more rare. Nor did I really take into account the fact that you are far more likely to run into a goblin throughout the course of your D&D career than you are a demi-lich. But it is based on something, okay? It is based on the totality of the monster stat blocks that are out there and available. So, I guess that's more empirical? We're going to say it is. So, based on my criteria, how well do you think acid damage performs?
So, I can't think off the top of my head of too many things that aren't dealing acid damage back to you that are particularly resistant to it or immune to it. And God, I can't think of a single thing that's vulnerable to it. So I don't think it's particularly bad. But at the same time, I can think of things that don't care about acid damage. So I'm going to say this is fairly middle of the pack, maybe a little higher.
You are correct. It is just exactly slightly higher than the middle of the list. Acid is my 4th best damage type.
We already made it to number 4? Wow.
Well, that's what happens when we go alphabetical. And I don't blame you for not being able to think of a single monster that is vulnerable to it when there is literally only one monster that is vulnerable to it.
Oh, man.
Which appears in the Ghosts of Saltmarsh book, which I'm pretty sure you don't own.
No.
The living iron statue is the only creature that is vulnerable to it.
I have unlocked it, but I have never thought to run Ghosts of Saltmarsh. And I've said before on the podcast, I don't typically read the adventures as thoroughly as I read the source books, because they're typically very setting and adventure specific. So, yeah, I've never read Ghosts of Saltmarsh front to back. But just one, that's crazy.
Just one. In fact, what I found when I compared a lot of monster vulnerabilities is that out of the 10 different magical damage types, of course not including slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning, only 4 of them have more than 2 monsters that are vulnerable to them.
Oh, man.
6 out of 10 different magical damage types have 2 or less creatures that are vulnerable to them. So the 4 that have 3 or more really stood out to me. Acid did not stand out for that reason. It is tied for the lowest with 2 others.
So I knew this a little bit going in, that vulnerability is not a major concern in 5e. They haven't given you a lot of opportunities to deal double damage with a particular damage type across that 2,000 and however many monsters you just said. At least, certainly not through the ones that I know well. So as we're talking about this, as we're going forward with what creatures are and aren't vulnerable to particular damage types, know that that's of a smaller concern for the most part than how many creatures are resistant or immune to that damage type, because that's going to be coming up a lot more often.
Yes, you're catching on. I did have to weight things much higher based on how many things were resistant and immune. In fact, I could almost say that monster resistances were the primary factor in determining where a particular damage type was going to end up on my list if there wasn't one really bucking the curve in terms of immunity. Don't worry, we'll get there. More on acid damage. As far as the creatures that are resistant and immune to it, across the spectrum of D&D monsters, acid actually performs pretty well. Only 92 creatures are resistant to it, and only 68 are immune. That's 3.75% of all monsters resistant, 2.77% of all monsters immune. And I think you mentioned you don't know a whole lot of spells that are actually dealing acid damage that are accessible by players. It's very middle of the road, coming in at only 18 spells that can produce this damage type. Now, a lot of those spells also can produce other damage types, things like, say, Chaos Bolt.
Good old Chaos Bolt.
Yeah, it's good. So when you take those out of the equation, it is a pretty low number, comparatively speaking. Just this side of middle of the road.
So I'm sure there are other creature types that are immune or resistant to acid, but I think some of the big hitters in this realm will be oozes that are basically made of acid. When a creature is entirely composed of an inorganic material, there's no organic material to corrode. And then there are a few dragons that have acid breath, and dragons are always immune to the kind of damage they produce with their breath weapons. So there's at least those two somewhat broad categories that we're dealing with where you should not be looking at acid so much.
Yeah, there is a running theme of things being resistant or immune to the type of damage that they most commonly use. But in addition to those sorts of creatures, I wouldn't recommend bringing acid up against any sort of Yugoloth or any aspect of any god ever.
I forget that that's on the table now. Damn.
They are included in these resistances and immunities because, like I said, I cast a wide net. But yes, in general, I think acid damage performs pretty well. It does have slightly below average numbers of creatures that are immune and resistant to it. So, number 4 spot for Steve.
All right, then let's compare that to something. So how does acid stack up to a damage type like cold?
Ooh, cold damage.
You're as cold as ice.
That is one of the most iconic elemental damage types, right?
Yeah, cone of cold, baby.
I know they kind of slept on it in Avatar: The Last Airbender. You know, they just went with water instead of ice, but cold damage is iconic. And that shows in how many spells are capable of producing cold damage. It is the second most produced damage type in Dungeons & Dragons, as far as magical spells are concerned.
I'm going to go ahead and call that it is only beat by fire.
You would be right about that.
Ha! I know Dungeons & Dragons.
I know Dungeons & Dragons. Cold damage can be produced by 27 different spells, while fire can be produced by 35, making them the 2 highest by a significant margin. How would you think that cold damage performs? And I do know that you probably have a pretty good beat on this one.
So, cold damage is a special favorite of mine, almost because I feel like fire is overdone, and I like that it is antithetical to that.
We're going to have words. We're going to throw hands.
I think fire is one of the more commonly used elements in terms of enemies having access to it. And when I think of an enemy being on fire or having access to fire or warmth, I think that there's going to be a lot of things that are just going to shrug cold damage off, either because they are acclimated to cold environments, like Yetis or Rimmer Haze or something like that, or because they're, literally made of fire. So I'm going to go with this being pretty low ranking on your list.
Right, you're thinking that their internal temperatures are just naturally so high that cold damage isn't really going to phase them?
Something like that.
Gotcha. Okay, well, you are correct. Cold damage is in a pretty good place. There are actually a decent number, comparatively speaking, of creatures that are vulnerable to it, coming in with 9, which is weirdly the third highest vulnerability.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those are some pretty low numbers, as we said.
Well, if it's still ranking low, then what we said about vulnerability not amounting to much must be true.
It is, and I wish that they had added in more vulnerabilities, because I feel like that's a really flavorful decision, but I'm not a game designer, and it's a really tough scale to balance anyway. As far as immunities are concerned, it is a little bit on the high side. There are a lot of undead and a lot of fiends that just do not care about cold damage. To your point that we had before the episode, you said that in the D&D fiction there are actually a couple of frozen circles of hell, I believe.
Yes.
I want to say, what is his name? Levistus. He's got one of those. So, 111 creatures, 4.53% of all monsters immune to cold damage entirely. That's not the part that really did cold damage in for me. It is the fact that out of all the different creatures in Dungeons & Dragons, it is the most resisted. And I mean, it is not even close.
Really?
Yeah, there are 309 creatures out there that are resistant to cold damage. That is 12.6%. To put that into perspective, the next most resisted is only 2/3 of that.
More than 10% of all monsters in D&D are resistant to cold damage?
Right.
Damn.
Look, I know there's a lot of Cone of Cold and Ray of Frost stands out there, and guys, just sit down for a minute, because when you're looking at ranking the different damage types based on how many creatures they are vulnerable, resistant, and immune to, you just got to understand that while your favorite damage type is going to be effective against almost 83% of creatures that you're going to come into contact with, most of these other damage types can boast a lot better numbers than that.
That's pretty damning. What number did you say you ranked this one at?
I didn't, but it is my second worst damage type.
There's one worse than 17% of monsters not wanting. Wow.
You would think that would be crazy, but it's so much better than the worst damage type that it just isn't even close. I know I'm probably going to say it isn't even close a lot, but again, cold damage is resisted by almost an additional 30% over the next most resisted type.
All right, all of your percentages are starting to make my head swim. I'm not going to good at percentages of percentages, Steven. Come on now.
You think that our listeners are going to enjoy us talking a bunch of numbers to start off season 2?
So here's the thing. You put that at your second worst. And I know my alphabet. I can still sing it. So fire is coming up next, and I would have bet money that fire, the easiest damage type to access in the game, and one that I know so many fiends and elementals and dragons don't give two hoots about, would have been worse than cold. But you're saying no.
I personally am saying no. Now, your mileage may vary, and I'm not prepared on this list to say that it's my way or the highway. I know that I've made some jokes about that in the past, but this is based on one particular set of criteria, and it's just the set of criteria that I care most deeply about. But your mileage may vary. But yes, fire did beat out cold on my ranking, and there's 2 reasons for that.
Okay, but just barely, right?
Yes. Don't worry, you're not that far off. Cold is my number 9, fire is my number 8, even though it holds a special place in my heart that keeps me warm.
Keeps you warm.
That makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. I do have to recognize that the numbers just don't hold it up. Remember when I was talking about the second most resisted damage type? This is it.
Yeah, see, that makes sense to me, because I can easily rattle off so many creatures, and admittedly most of them fiends, that don't care about being hit with fire, that will literally laugh it off. I think we had jokes about Balthazar the Cambion in some of our intros and how he wanted to be paired up with a dragon because he could also fly and was immune to the dragon's flame breath. Like, there's just a lot of creatures that don't care about fire.
Right, that would make sense. You know, someone in human resources should really have a look at that.
Yeah, minion management. What a department.
So yes, while cold damage takes the cake as most resisted with 309 creatures, fire comes in second with 241. Now, that's a pretty big disparity, which was one of the 2 nails in the cold coffin. As I'm sure you've already guessed, fire is the second most immune damage type.
Second? Are you sure you did the math right on this?
I'm sure. You just gotta wait. You just gotta wait, man. You're gonna see. 111 creatures immune to cold, 165 immune to fire. That's a pretty big difference. In fact, when you add those 2 numbers together, you end up with 2 numbers in the low 400s of total monsters that these damage types are not effective against, with fire being the one that more creatures are immune to. So you would think, Steve, if immunity counts for more than resistance, why is fire not under cold?
Yeah, I'd rather do half damage than no damage any day.
And you would be right to think that way. The only reason that fire damage came out a little bit on top for me is because that it is the damage type that creatures are most vulnerable to by a country mile.
Oh, okay. So I'd rather do half damage than no damage, but when you throw double damage in there...
When you throw double damage in, it makes a pretty big difference. And when I say by a country mile, the second highest number that a damage type can boast in terms of vulnerability is 14 creatures. Fire inverts that to a full 41.
I mean, that's not a big number in the terms of the other numbers that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the episode, but for vulnerability... That's a big disparity between first and second place. So I imagine that's got to be like plant creatures, right? Like anything made of wood in D&D is going to go up in flames.
And you would be right about that. Fire damage is the only damage type that boasts a vulnerability over 1%. Remember, most damage types don't have more than 2, and yet fire has 41.
That makes a difference. It is fair to put it above cold. I dunk on fire a lot. In fact, when we were making the cantrips episode, I made some pretty bold statements about how bad fire damage was. I don't think any of them made it into the episode, but this makes me repent of some of those things. I'm sorry, fire damage. You have your place.
Let's hope they don't make it into the episode. Otherwise, you got burned. You'd have got flamed for those comments.
Okay, let's move on. Why don't we talk about force damage? All right, I'm standing by this one.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You know what? I'm tempted to just let you talk about force damage.
This is my favorite damage type in the game, and you with your number crunching aren't going to change that for me. Okay, Steven? I can't think of anything that's vulnerable to force damage, but man, everything that is resistant to this or that or immune to this or that, force damage just works on them. When something is immune to almost every damage type, like, say, a ghost or a poltergeist or an incorporeal undead, it doesn't care about fire, it doesn't care about poison or cold or lightning. When all else is failing you, force damage works. So, force damage is my favorite damage type. So, tell me, Steve, is it your favorite damage type?
No. But that's okay.
You're allowed to be wrong. It's fine.
Well, the reason that you like force damage is obvious, and we did talk about this a little bit in the cantrips episode when we were going over the boons of Eldritch Blast. Force damage, in terms of the creatures that are vulnerable, resistant, and immune, all single-digit numbers. All fractions of a percent.
There you go. See, force damage just works. Maybe it's not going to do 8d6 in a 20-foot radius circle like Fireball is going to do, but everything that force damage hits, I guess apparently with some small niche exceptions, single-digit exceptions, Steve, the amount of force damage you do to a creature, it's taking that amount of damage.
You're saying that when you want to overcome a creature's resistances and immunities, you should use the force.
Okay. Yes. I think we got these jokes out in the intro. But yes, I mean, that's the thing. It is reliable. This is old reliable. This is your trusty damage type when you just want to make sure that a creature is going to take the damage you pump into it. That's what makes Eldritch Blast great. That's what makes Magic Missile great. It has such terrible damage, but it always hits, and it always does the damage it promises.
Yep, I can hardly argue with that, but I'm going to say the numbers anyway, just so that everyone's on the same page. 2 creatures vulnerable to force damage making get tied for the second least, but only 9 creatures resistant and only 5 creatures immune. It is the only one that can boast single-digit numbers in resistance and immunity, making it by far the most reliable in terms of getting through, as you said, making it my number 2.
Okay, I'm rage looking up monsters on D&D Beyond right now to find out what it is immune to, and they're all creatures.
They're new things.
They're
very new things. They had to. D&D is going through this problem right now where they have found a lot of power gamers out there breaking the game, and they're looking for ways to challenge them. They thought they were making a real challenge when they put the Tarrasque in the monster manual. And they gave it this big CR, and unless our players are dumb enough to fight gods, this is going to be the pinnacle of what they can hope to achieve. And now there are players out there who have come up with builds that can one-shot gods.
So I'll give it a pass on the Helmed Horror. I didn't remember the Helmed Horror. That's a monster manual creature that's immune to force damage, but okay. Anyway, but number 2, all right, so whenever we get to whatever your number 1 is, we gonna fight. We gonna fight.
That's fine.
Force damage, at least you weren't crazy enough to put it any lower.
And like I said, this has been one of your favorites the whole way through because they're having to add creatures that are immune to all sorts of stuff in order to make the game a little bit more challenging. And that's all coming up in recent years as they try to escalate things to keep up with the power gamers for those DMs that need it. And boy, there are some DMs out there that need that so they don't have to homebrew their own unstoppable juggernauts. Force damage, great damage type. Rob's number 1, Steve's number 2, undoubtedly effective. Moving on next to lightning.
Okay, so I can't think of a lot of things about this damage type either way. I know, like, if you hit a flesh golem with it, since they're, like, Frankenstein-inspired, they get, like, weirdly supercharged, which isn't necessarily vulnerable, or I suppose that falls under immunity. And then there are dragons with lightning breath, but there's not a lot of, like, lightning elementals, and I can't think of a particular creature type that is just completely resistant or immune to it like I can with fiends and undead and oozes and whatnot. So middle of the pack, well, no, I guess this would be a little higher than middle of the pack then. I'm guessing, well, wait, we already gave away the number 4 spot. Is this number 3?
No, but I like where your head's at, because lightning damage, out of all of the classic elemental damage types, did make it to the top spot. It just happens that the classic elemental damage types don't go very high on my list.
Okay.
I would actually kind of like to talk about lightning and the one that it barely lost to in tandem, because it's going to be really hard to talk about why they ended up in these positions without referencing the other. Handily enough, the one that just beat it out is also the next one on the list. Necrotic damage.
Okay, so I would have put necrotic fairly low on the list. I mean, it's a very exciting damage type, and there's a lot of spells that just deal a lot of it at one time. Sickening Radiance, and Blight, and Inflict Wounds. But there's a lot of creatures in Dungeons & Dragons that are undead, that are already dead, that necrotic damage just doesn't bother. And we talked in our undead episode, go back and listen to that if you haven't, about just how many undead there are in D&D. So I'm surprised this one is close to something I thought was near the top of the list.
You know, I might surprise you, because in my opinion, necrotic damage is a little better than lightning. Lightning and necrotic, for me, are two kind of middle-of-the-road damage types, right? They're not tipping out the scales in terms of how great they are or in terms of how bad they are. Necrotic damage and lightning damage both have only 2 creatures that are vulnerable to them, and they have fairly similar immunity numbers, 90 creatures being immune to necrotic damage and 88 creatures being immune to lightning. So, pretty comparable numbers, right? What really made a difference for me to break apart these two fairly, I would have considered average performers in all other respects, is that necrotic damage is resisted by 124 monsters. 5%.
Makes sense.
Lightning damage is resisted by 217 monsters.
What?
Pushing it up to 8.85%, making it the 3rd most resisted damage type. I'm telling you, man, the elemental damage types just took a big hit in terms of how many creatures can resist them.
What's so immune to lightning damage?
Well, there's the things that deal lightning damage, as there are with all other things, like we've mentioned before, but the biggest difference is that there are over 100 fiends that are resistant to lightning damage.
Really? See, I think of those things as being resistant to their environments, right? Like cold and heat. That makes sense to me, but that many are resistant to lightning.
I think the way that you probably should be thinking of it is that fiends are just resistant to elemental damage at large.
Yeah, that's a good argument. Okay, so, I mean, your numbers don't lie, whether or not I like them. Necrotic definitely does have an edge over lightning.
And like I said, in all other ways, they were pretty similar, so that's why they ended up next to each other on my list. Necrotic taking the number 6 spot, lightning taking number 7. So for those keeping track, cold, fire, and lightning are 9, 8, and 7 on my list.
Wow, all right. I need to go home and rethink my life. Or at least my spell book.
Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Watched it with my kids for the first time this past week. So glad they're finally old enough to start watching those.
Okay, so that's over halfway through. What's next?
So next up on the list, alphabetically, would be poison damage. We've talked about it a good bit recently, actually, because you've mentioned that it is one of the more prevalent damage types that enemies or the environment can deal to players. So how do you think that it stacks up as a damage type that players can use spells to cast against their enemies?
First, I don't think of a lot of ways that players can make use of poison without actually going and making it or buying it and coating weapons with it. I can't think of a lot of spells or anything like that they would have access to it.
And for good reason, because it is actually the least produced of the damage types that we're going to be discussing today, with only 10 out of the 534 spells in Dungeons & Dragons able to produce it, and some of those are the ones that have a little bit of overlap. So, a fairly rare damage type to produce.
Okay, there you go. I don't know, I mean, I don't think of it as being great, but I think of it a lot from the player's perspective, because dwarves are resistant to poison damage, right? Like, Yuan Ti are, I don't remember if they're resistant or immune, but them and grungs also don't care for poison, so, I mean, not terrible, but not great either. So, fairly low.
Right, and I mean, monks become immune to poison at level 10. It's not too uncommon for players to be resistant or immune to it. The problem is, it's not that infrequently a resisted or immune damage type by the monsters either.
Okay. I mean, that tracks. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Well, you're doing better than me then, because, like I said, back in the day, I used to equate acid and poison damage. Acid damage is now my number 4, and poison is nowhere close. Let's talk vulnerabilities. 1.
1?
1. Yeah, the lowest.
What's that 1? What is doubly vulnerable to poison damage?
A body taker plant from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, fairly recently released.
A body taker plant.
Yep. Before that, there was nothing.
I mean, I feel like that's fair. Like, it's poison. It's kind of a great equalizer. It does what it's supposed to do if it works at all, I would think.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why a lot of poison effects, I think, are typically save for none. There's not a lot of save for half poison damages like there is for most of the elemental damage types.
Sure, makes sense. And the resistances kind of hold that up. It's pretty much dead on middle of the road in terms of how many creatures resist it. I mean, not in terms of percentages, but of the 10 damage types. It is the 6th most resisted, coming in with 99 creatures. But, Rob, do you remember that I told you that there was one damage type that put all others to shame in terms of how many creatures were totally immune to it?
I believe the phrase was not even close.
Not even close. We have come to that point.
Or was it a country mile? I forget.
Remember that I said earlier that the second most immune damage type was fire, coming in with 165.
Okay. I mean, I really thought fire kind of took the cake on that one, so this one has a few more.
Yeah, just a couple. Poison comes in at 640 creatures completely immune to poison.
600 and what?
640. 26% of all monsters that exist in Dungeons & Dragons are completely immune to poison. When you couple that with its resistances, it is moderately to completely ineffective against over 30% of monsters in this game. There is a reason the designers did not give you very many options to create this damage type.
30%? Wow. Okay. All right, hold on. All right, we need to think about this.
Yeah, let's think about it. Can you guess where this falls in terms of my estimation of the damage types?
Okay, so poison's the worst.
Poison's the worst. And I don't just mean that in terms of my damage types. It's just the worst.
So where is this coming from? Let's think. Constructs, obviously. Things without bodies. Probably immune to poison. There are dragons, like everything else, that breathe poison, so they're immune. Grungs and Yuan-Ti and other snake creatures. A lot of fiends are also... Fiends are immune to a lot of stuff, and poison's just not an exception. They're used to gross stuff, and... Undead. Undead's it, isn't it? You can't poison a body that's no longer functioning biologically.
Right. I mean, there aren't that many constructs percentage-wise in terms of all the different monsters that exist in D&D, but when you take out that entire category, and then you take out 171 undead, and then you take out almost 200 fiends, there's just not a lot left.
Damn. I mean, so poison of any kind is completely ineffective. I always thought poison spray was a crap cantrip, but man...
Oh, it's probably the second crappiest. Right behind True Strike.
This puts it right in that True Strike territory. Holy crap.
Yeah, I have difficulty expressing this. It is over 4 times more creatures immune to poison damage than fire damage. It's runner-up. It's just no contest. Poison is the worst.
Hang on. Just tell me this real quick. Are all other... immunities combined as much as poison?
I'm doing math, which I love to do. Yes! Yes! But only by 19. 640 creatures are out of the... There are 640 creatures that are immune to poison, and 659 that are immune to anything but poison.
Okay, so poison sucks.
I am glad you asked that question. That is just damning. I am very willing to be judge, jury, and executioner. Poison damage.
Worst damage.
Is the worst.
Okay.
Moving on from poison, because we must.
We have nowhere to go but up.
And yes, literally, we have now gone through my number 10 spot to my number 6 spot, so everything that's left is pretty decent. Above average, even, in terms of my estimation. Psychic damage.
Okay, we've got this and Radiant and Thunder damage left, and... I'm saving a good spot for Radiant, because I think it's good. But Psychic damage is pretty important to several classes, and definitely several subclasses in the game.
Oh yeah, Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, baby. My favorite kind of sorcerer. Probably the only one I'll ever play, now that I think of it.
Even more so, the College of Whispers Bard with its Psychic Blades, or the Soul Knife for the Rogue class. They're doing psychic damage every turn. So if you're basing your entire character around that, they can't have given too many creatures resistance or immunity to it, because it just kind of screws your entire character concept. So...
Yeah, thank goodness they didn't make a poison knife rogue, because that actually makes a lot more sense and would just be woefully ineffective in this game.
So did you give this... Is the number 3 spot left? Is this your number 3?
The number 3 spot is left, and unfortunately, no. This is the one that I expected to be impressed by, but Psychic ends up taking my number 5 spot.
Oh, no.
I actually ended up lumping it in with necrotic damage, kind of like I did with lightning. And for the record, I consider necrotic damage to be my baseline. Like, if a damage type performs as well or better than necrotic, I think it's a good damage type, which unfortunately means I don't care much for elemental spells anymore, not after having done this research.
So, if it's not high up on your list, I'm guessing aberrations are the reason why. Like psionic creatures from other worlds that deal psychic damage back to the party.
Again, we're talking about my number 5 spot. Psychic damage is a solid performer. It just doesn't do as well as the things above it. So, let's talk numbers. Psychic damage, only one creature that is vulnerable to it.
When you say there's only one, you gotta tell me what the one is.
The Flump.
The Flump?
The beloved Flump.
The Underdark jellyfish?
I thought it was celestial. Is it not celestial?
No, it's an aberration, dude.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, yeah. Apparently, you could just hurt its feelings.
It takes things personally.
It does.
And could die from it.
Vicious Mockery, most effective spell against the Flump.
They have so few hit points, it could genuinely die from a weak-ass insult.
Don't hate on the Flumps for being sensitive.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
But it is a fun flavor choice. Okay, in terms of resistances, third least resisted. That's why I thought that Psychic was going to go all the way, baby. I was expecting it to take my number 3 spot. But the immunities just kind of knocked it out of the running. For all the other great things about it, it still had 98 creatures that are immune to it.
98? That many aberrations?
Well, there are a bunch of aberrations, but the kicker is, if you stop and think about it, there's a lot of creatures in Dungeons & Dragons that don't have a mind to affect.
Okay, so constructs.
Constructs, yeah. They account for almost 2/3 of the psychic immune creatures, really boosting that number and really hurting its ranking in my book.
That makes sense. I don't use constructs enough when I run. I don't think of them as often as maybe I should.
And with you being my primary dungeon master, I haven't run into, I think, any constructs, maybe one. So maybe that's why I thought it was going to go a little bit further.
Animated armors. I know I love my animated armors.
If you're looking holistically across all levels, across all source books, this is about as high as it can go. 4th most immune keeps it from going any higher.
All right, well, we're coming to the end of the list. Radiant and Thunder left.
Yes, we are. I won't try to bury the lead here. Radiant damage is my absolute favorite. Just eking its way past force damage for my number 1 spot.
All right, you better make a damn good case for this.
Well, I'll do my best. Let me just go ahead and get this out of the way. Radiant damage and force damage are both fantastic, and they both are cast about the same amount of times. There are 21 spells that deal each type of damage respectively, and the numbers are pretty comparable in terms of immunities. While radiant damage doesn't boast single-digit numbers like the 5 that force has, it's only 13. It's not that far off. It's still a fraction of a percent.
I'd like to argue that that's an unlucky number, Your Honor, and put a point in the force damage column.
Well, if you need a legitimate point in the force damage column, we should look at resistances, because force damage only has 9 creatures resistant to it, while radiant has 24. Still less than 1%, but 2.5 times higher.
If you're trying to convince me that radiant is better than force damage, you're not doing a good job so far.
I know, and maybe this is just a little bit of a bias where I'm trying to make vulnerabilities mean something eventually, but radiant damage does boast 7 times more creatures than force damage does. I mean, granted, we're talking about the difference between 14 and 2, so numerically it's not big, but I mean, come on. It's the second most vulnerable type of damage, and 7 times higher than Force.
Well, we said towards the start of the episode, back in the acid days, that we weren't really going to be giving vulnerabilities bear that much weight in our decisions. And if we're sticking to that, I stand by force damage. But I will say this in your column. Radiant damage spells and class features like Divine Smite have an opportunity to crit that force damage spells and class features typically don't.
Outside of Eldritch Blast, of course.
Outside of Eldritch Blast. So when you find that crit and you deal some radiant damage to something that is vulnerable to it, that's going to be a life-changing moment. That's going to be a defining moment in your character's adventure. Force damage is not very exciting. I will give you that. It is, again, it's old reliable. It's your trusty sidearm. It's always going to do what it promises to do. Radiant damage is going to come through on occasion and really make a statement. And is going to be dependable, just maybe not as dependable as force damage. So, if you were going to put anything above force damage, this is the one.
And I'm giving it a couple of bonus points for reasons we discussed last episode, like how it can prevent vampires from healing. It has a couple of little niche areas where it does come in extra handy.
That actually came up in my last session. As of the time of us recording this episode, we've had 3 sessions of our new Twitch campaign, Bleakhaven, A Broken Heart, over on Misty Mountain Streaming. And they were up against an undead assassin who had a regeneration ability that they prevented from working multiple rounds, quite on accident, just because the cleric had radiant damage in her pocket. I'll give it to you. Force wouldn't have done that.
There you go. If you're looking for something that's a little bit less thinky and number crunching and want something that's a little bit more entertaining and exciting to start Bardic's Twinspiration Season 2, go check out Rob's campaign on Twitch.
I will say, for 3 sessions in, a lot has happened, and my players are doing wonderful things and terrible things. This could be one of the better games I've run. Certainly, probably the best one we've streamed so far.
Well, I'm going to try to hold back my bias that I could definitely have based on Divine Smite, Guiding Bolt, Word of Radiance, and other spells and features like that, and say that I would validate someone's decision, even yours, to put force damage in the number 1 spot. But I think that it's something that we can easily agree upon that these are the first and second place, regardless of which order you put them in.
So where does that leave thunder damage?
I don't know. Third place!
People still know that reference, right?
We used to do that routine when we were younger. It took us a long way. Yes! Thunder damage, 3rd spot. I did not expect it to do so well. I kind of lumped it in with the other elemental damage types and thought that it was going to end up towards the bottom, but thunder damage is a consistent performer.
So you're telling me that all of my bards who took Thunderwave made a good decision?
Actually, yeah, kind of so. I mean, when you look at it in terms of vulnerabilities, resistances, and immunities, thunder damage comes in top 4 of every category.
Huh.
It might not shine the way that radiant damage does, but it's a pretty consistent damage type. And honestly, it is now my top choice for the metamagic feature Transmute spell, because unless you know that a creature is vulnerable to one of the other types of damage that it can produce, it's a pretty safe bet that it is not resisted or immune to thunder.
I guess that makes sense, because thunder damage, unlike lightning damage, it's not electrocution, it's not fire, it's not a physical thing as much. It's like pressure, like sound waves and sonic assaults. And
yeah,
I guess there's some similarity there to force in a way.
Mm-hmm. It's a shockwave that kind of affects you from an auditory standpoint, right? Make your ears ring, make your ears bleed, or push you back. Thunder damage is awesome. Here comes the boom. You've been thunderstruck. All right, let's talk some numbers. It comes in at the 4th most vulnerable with, only 5. It comes in at the 4th least resisted with only 66. And it comes in as the 3rd least immune with only 21.
Yeah, those numbers didn't sound all that small to me until we've gone over the rest of this list. And I realize that those are pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
Right, yeah, out of anything other than Force and Radiant, it just seems to be one of the least swingy damage types. Like, usually if you find something that has a low resistance, you're probably going to find it with a pretty high immune, or the other way around. While it can't touch the low numbers offered by Radiant or Force, it just doesn't swing. It's just a straight shooter.
Other than your top two, this is the only damage type that creatures are resistant or immune to less than 100 times.
Combined, correct, yes.
This is double digits. Everything else is more than that. And by a good little bit. By half again, most of the time.
Yeah, less than 100 creatures have special rules for thunder damage across all three of the categories. The one thing that I do have to say against thunder damage is that it does get completely shut down by the silence spell. Again, it's an auditory damage type. So you stop sound waves, you stop the thunder.
Wow. I never caught that little statement in that spell. I always imagined it as an offensive thing, like shutting down an enemy spellcaster or something of the like. I never thought about it. Like, if you come into because anything's possible in D&D, if there's just a room or a hallway that is just perpetually being bombarded with thunder damage, you can just walk around with silence or cast a few spells and defeat that part of the dungeon or that encounter or that creature. That's weird.
Yeah, and conversely, if you have a room that is perpetually under the effect of the silence spell, then your thunder casting mage is going to be pretty useless.
He's going to have a bad time.
I can't believe that this doesn't come up in Critical Role Campaign 2, because I feel like Ford used thunder damage a lot. But it is just one of those odd little interactions that's probably not going to come up at most tables. But hey, DMs, if you find your players leaning a little heavily on that as their go-to spell, that's the way to shut them down for a couple rounds. Or make them prioritize targeting the enemy mage that's holding concentration on that spell.
So, this has been an interesting little number-filled romp through the damage types.
Lots of numbers. Folks, I apologize to those of you who are looking for something that was going to be all advice or all yucks. This is something that I need to get off my chest so that it could, hopefully set a precedent for episodes to come and any future evaluations that I do upon spells.
So why don't we summarize everything for the people who just wanted to get the numberless categorization out of us, the rankings?
Yes. Okay, let's go ahead and go over the list from top to bottom. My personal first, radiant damage. Rob's personal first, force damage. And the other person's favorite coming in second either way. After that, I think it gets a little bit more consistent and a little bit more empirical, at least based on the criteria that we're using, going from third place with thunder damage to acid, psychic, necrotic, lightning, fire, cold, and then coming in at the bottom place of number 10, poison.
So, yeah, if you're looking through your spells and you see the opportunity to take something that does radiant, force, or thunder, that's going to be a strong choice. And if you are looking at something that is fire, cold, or poison, those are pretty distantly at the bottom of the list, with basically everything else filtering in the middle.
Right. Now, I will say that some of those elemental damage spells, they do offer you a lot of damage dice for their level to make up for things. So, spells like Fireball and Cone of Cold are crowd favorites because they let you roll a lot of math rocks. Just realize that may come at an eventual opportunity cost when you come up to these resistant or immune creatures.
Right, and, the vast majority of monsters out there in D&D are still going to take damage like anything would take damage, right? Like, they're not going to be resistant or immune, or even the creatures that are resistant or immune to one thing are not going to be resistant or immune to another. So, you're going to get in your hits with Fireball, with Cone of Cold, and you're probably going to hit a lot of them, because they typically make up for it by having very large areas of effect. But radiant force damage, man. Just, radiant force damage.
But the reason that we made this is just so that if you are taking a look at all the different spell options that you have when you level up, and you can't decide between two, as so often happens to me, you can maybe think back to this episode or give it another listen and use this criteria to help you make an informed decision about which of those is going to be a more consistent performer for you. And maybe this information about monster immunities and resistances will be useful to you when you're playing at tables with new DMs. I mean, if I sit down at Rob's table, I can be reasonably confident that psychic damage is a good choice because I'm probably not going to come up against a lot of constructs. And
well, now...
But we also know that Rob likes undead, so maybe I should avoid cold and poisoned choices also.
Don't you try and metagame me, you son of a gun. Anyway... Were you like me hearing this list? Were you surprised by the sheer number of some of these immunities, vulnerabilities, resistances? Was this pretty close to what you would have predicted?
Heck, I made this list and I was surprised by some of them.
If you, like me, have opinions and feelings about this spreadsheet that Steve made, come and let us know in our community Discord. We're in there every day talking about Dungeons and Dragons and planning out future episodes or just hanging out with you guys.
Nothing makes me log on to the Discord quicker than the potential for an argument.
Me, it's a meme, but, you know. But if you want to join up, link is in the description of the episode, along with links to our social accounts. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, we're lots of places.
And don't forget about that new campaign that Rob just started running over on the Misty Mountain Streaming Twitch channel, running as always for a couple of the Misty Mountain Gaming adventurers, a cast entirely of some of your favorites from the cosplay community.
Yeah, if you are intimidated by the back catalog of Critical Role that you would have to watch to catch up, you've only got a few sessions with us. The VODs are on Twitch, and if they've expired there, they can always be found on Misty Mountain Gaming's YouTube channel. Links to both of those in the description of the video, and new episodes air every Monday at 7 p.m. Central.
Lots of different ways to get in touch with us, lots of different content to consume, and lots of different ways to hold you over until the next episode of Bardic Twinspiration. The outro music you're listening to right now is called Mega Epic, and the intro music is called Super Epic. Both were composed by the wonderfully talented Alexander Nakarada and utilized under a Creative Commons license. If you enjoyed our content, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your listening app of choice. To keep up with us on social media, look us up on facebook.com/Bardic Twinspiration and on Twitter @BTwinspiration. Want to interact with us directly? Come join our Discord. After all, who are we if not people who are willing to roll the dice on making some new friends? Links in the description. Come check it out. Watch how force damage uses the power of force! Started thinking like, power force! Is that intentionally a power force reference? Watch out, force! Alright, you ready to kick this pig?
Yep, that's still a reference that both of us understand that nobody else does.
One forgets that. We got off on a little bit of a tangent when we were preparing.
Preparing.
Alright, let me pull up my acid notes.
Your acid notes.
Somewhere in the middle of that, insert me saying, who you gonna call? Force damage!
I don't know that I will honor that, but good to have the option nonetheless.
You said when you're talking about all these different kinds of undead, you know, who you gonna call? Force damage! Robert, can you hear me? It seems like you've gone away. I don't know who I'm talking to. Sitting here missing you. It's like you've gone away. I want to record a podcast. Now you're gone. Discord, can you tell me why?
Hi.
Hey, you died.
Yeah, I'm still recording. I could still hear you. Let's just close Discord and try it again, I guess.
That's what I did, but you try it on your end.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not connecting to you.
Did I lose? Oh my gosh, I lost internet. Stop making more work for me in the middle of the episode. The only spot that's left. Third place, baby.
Third place. Abbott and Costello, anybody? Right at the 2-hour mark. Kill it
Kill it.
with fire.
Gotta do something.
So you know an unsettling thing?
I know a few.
I had a mouse trap here in the studio, and it is now missing.
Drag it off, huh?
Yeah, so that means it was tripped, and then the thing that it should have killed was feeling fine enough to wander off. Here's the thing, this is a closed room, and I can't find the thing.
Oh, she'll have an Upa-mouse.
There's lots of holes for like a mouse or some small rodent to escape through, but they're not big enough for it to like take the trap with it. And even if it did, it would leave the trap somewhere out here, right? But I can't find the thing. So it's not dead, it's strong, and it's angry, and it's good at hiding.